All right. So again, we're going to go ahead and start our Biblio Soup program. This week, we're focusing on the history of the book. I don't know, Gary, this is actually your program. Why don't you, if you had any words to say, I am going to start with a video of Cindy's presentation, but maybe you have something to say to get us started here.
Not really. I think we identified this as being a fairly broad subject that people could kind of think on their own and bring forth anything that might relate to the history of the book. Either it could be from a long time ago, or it could be fairly current. So I think there's would be interesting to see what people come up with.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and start with Cindy's presentation, and I'm just going to start the video here and just make sure everybody can hear this. All right. And
okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Richardson. I'm sorry not to be able to join you in person, so to speak, but glad this is an option since I'm really enthusiastic about my book. I've served on the Book Club of Washington board for a number of years, and I am responsible for getting a lot of the communication that you receive out to you. So my book is called Biblio Pola, Pictures and Texts About the Book Trade by Siegfried Taubert. It's in 2 volumes. If we could see that slide maybe while I'm talking about it. Yeah, the first slide here, you see that, of course, the 2 volumes. It was published in Germany in 1966 and distributed in the US and Canada by R.R. Bauker. The text is in German, English, and French. The introductory volume, which is that slim one, contains 317 details from the plates in volume 2, along with the author's commentary, and it's arranged by subject groups that he's pulled together. Volume 2 contains 258 plates, a few of which I will be showing you. 42 of them are in full color, and those are arranged chronologically. Included is the earliest known picture of a bookshop exterior from 12th century China, and the first picture of the outside of a European bookshop identified as Biblio Pola from 1533. And I found that Biblio Pola means bookseller, especially of secondhand or rare books. The author / compiler, Siegfried Taubert, who died in 2008 at the age of 93, is perhaps best remembered as the head of the Frankfurt Book Fair from 1958 to 1973. His obituary notice stated, we all owe him an infinite amount. Without him, the book fair would not exist in its current form. And I enjoyed reading the author's description in the preface about how this whole project originated. He writes, in the course of some early travels as a young bookseller, I came across an amusing engraving in a box of oddments in a secondhand bookshop in Stockholm. Published in 1795, it showed the English bookseller James Lackington climbing into a coach, watched by an admiring and mocking crowd, while a dog relieves itself on a volume of his memoirs. Now that's what you're seeing in the first slide there. After I had found out a little about its subject and after reading the memoirs, the picture came to be more than just a lucky find. I began to look, not very systematically, I admit, for similar material concerning the book trade. But then came the war, which put an end to such frivolous pleasures. About 15 years after my Stockholm find, which I had long since lost, I discovered another copy in a London bookshop. I bought it, and from the pleasure of this renewed acquaintance grew a desire to take up the thread again. This is meant to be a picture book of the book trade, no more. It seemed absurd to try to combine the history of the book trade with my subject. If, looking at this book and reading in it, A few reminders of the history of the trade should present themselves, all the better. Here and there, I may have helped this process in the descriptions and accompanying texts, but these cannot be more than mere suggestions. More than anything else, this bibliopolical panopticon is intended as a feast for the eyes. And it certainly is. This is one of those books that you can just open any place and have fun, looking at the illustration, reading the accompanying text. I mean, you could while away endless hours with this book. So be warned if you acquire a copy. So we looked at that first illustration, which I think it's that first grabbed his attention. The second illustration here is from a Nuremberg manuscript of 1543, and it's a portrait of a contemporary publisher and bookseller. And the interesting thing about this one is that the way the books were packed in barrels, they apparently were able to withstand transport much better using that method. So if we could see the next group of slides. Okay. I was delighted. There are a few examples from 18th and 19th century Japan, and this is a traveling woman bookseller from 1720. The texts belonging to this picture indicate that she carried with her all kinds of different writings, including music books and writings on women. At the top of the pack that she's carrying is a container for a popular series of short stories and novels in 54 volumes. Now here's another lovely color illustration. It says it's a stall at the Frankfurt Fair in the archway of a house. It is protected from sun and rain by a roof. Now this is down in the lower right-hand corner, what he's describing here. Among the great variety of wares are also books and prints. The stall keeper is pointing to his wares, and a prospective customer is studying one of the prints, and that's from 1775. Oh, thank you, Tim. Yes, that's this. Okay, next, please.
Maybe?
No,
Ah.
it's stalled.
Yep. See, I try and be impressive. Look what I've messed it up. So, all fancy with my pointer. None of that stuff.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, so on the left, you see, it says, standing in front of the bookshop, this London beauty of the late 18th century demonstrates her interest for the higher things in life. Perhaps she was a subscriber to the lending library, which was maintained here as well. You can see it says circulating library up there at the very top. A charming and interesting picture of the exterior of an English bookshop of the time. And this is a copper engraving from 1782. And then on the right, who could resist the fascination of this picture? Isabella Tinkler is a symbol for all time to the extensive scope the book trade grants, even to those whose eccentricities border on crankiness. I just love the text sometimes. It's so much fun. This is a copper engraving from 1794, probably from London. Next. Okay, on the left you see a reproduction of a painting created in 1820, whom the author says characterizes as probably the most beautiful interpretation of a bookshop there is, worthy to rank with other Dutch examples, all of which testify to the high reputation which the Dutch book trade enjoyed in past centuries as it does now. And then this is moving quite far geographically. In 1828, the venerable Old Corner bookstore was set up in the slate building erected in 1711. 4 years later, the shop was taken over by W.D. Ticknor and became an intellectual meeting place of Boston and the New England states. Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, and Parkman were among those who frequented it. And that's an etching from 1835. Oh, this one I got a kick out of. His description is a grisette, and when I had to look that one up, which that's a young working class French woman, visits her bookseller and lending librarian to return some volumes she has borrowed, but which found no favor with her. This time, the charming young girl hopes she will be served with something more entertaining. This is a lithograph from 1840. Next, please. Okay. All right, and here we see on the left, it says, the artist expresses here all the pleasure felt by a bibliophile who has discovered a treasure among the books he has been rummaging through. That's a lithograph from 1858. We're already at the last one. It was really hard to choose. I mean, any of them would have been, I would have been pleased to show you. It says here, the bookseller and antiquary, who is most certainly the subject of this picture, is reading a folio volume. And this is an illustration by George Cruikshank, who may be a familiar name. He did some of the illustrations for Dickens, for Oliver Twist, and he also did caricatures and was and illustrated other books. So I just I don't know, that one just kind of caught my eye. So that's it for me. As I said, this is a delightful book, and there seem to be quite a few copies available should you want to pursue that. My apparently it was originally issued in a cardboard slipcase, which my copies didn't come with, but it didn't look too prepossessing, so I'm not that concerned about it. So very good. If you have any questions about this book or any of my remarks, feel free to email me at cindyr347@gmail.com. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. That was really fabulous, and we'll be sure to pass on your email as well in the notes for folks. But amazing book. I love the illustrations. Very beautiful. And I think that my kids can relate to seeing me resembling the guy there on the right. So
That's great.
Probably a few of our members probably have had that expression on their face at some point. So
yes, there are as many illustrations will strike a familiar chord, some very close to home.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Cindy.
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to say, Tim, that was very nicely done. You know, it all of a sudden it does, in some ways, it's easier to see stuff like this than it is just passing a book around the room.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and then here's Cindy's email if somebody had any questions that they wanted to send to her. Should we go on to the next one, Gary? Okay. All right. So, Tamara.
Sure. Yeah, so I chose the Nuremberg Chronicles, and I just happen to have 3 leaves. And I'm not at all an expert of this, but I'm kind of late to getting into the bibliophile, even though I had a long history working in libraries, but only in about the last 7 years have I gotten really interested in book history. And when I took a class at the London Rare Book School on black and white illustrations, and they brought out the Nuremberg Chronicles, I got really excited about the story behind it. So I've collected the 3 leaves from it. It was actually published then in 1493. I'll do a brief thing. And if you think about it, the Gutenberg Bible came out in 1455. And then in 1493, they do the Nuremberg Chronicles. And it's a world history or history of the world, big chronicle thing, kind of follows stages, kind of like the creation story or whatever. But what's exciting about it is it's the first time that they're able to integrate imagery with text in terms of they use these wood blocks and then they're using the printing press kind of text. And before that, if they would have had a picture, it would have been hand drawn. They would have left space probably during the manuscript tradition and I think later in the early printing. So they published this in 1493. They come out with the Latin first, And that comes out in like about July of 14. Now you can start doing the images. So shoot a mile. Well, they're going to look similar and you're not going to be able to read the language anyway. So they're integrating these wood chip or wood blocks in with the kind of the text. There's about 1,800, it's probably way too many, but wood blocks that are used, and they are repeated. So sometimes the same image could be used in another part of the book as being somebody else, or a town could be, where they use an image of a town, it might show up later in the book representing another town. So that part's kind of funny. But they did it so the Latin came out in July, and by December they came out with the German. It was one of the most well-documented books too, in terms of all the legal aspects of how they tried to carve out all the different kinds of aspects of the printers and the editors. I'm not being very clear in saying that, but there's the huge archives about this. So it's really helpful in documenting early histories of books. But then what's exciting, and they knew this was going to happen, is as soon as they were very secretive about all the woodcuts and everything, because they knew as soon as it came out that somebody else would probably hijack it. And sure enough, another copy gets printed about 5 years later in Augsburg. It's a smaller version, and which will be the next picture probably. Can I have another slide? Yeah, and you can see how much smaller. Oh, that's actually still one of the big ones. Okay, the originals came out, they were about 12 by 18 inches. And then when you get to the next one, the pirated one, except pirated is not an appropriate term because there was no copyright back then. Can you go one more slide? Yeah, so this one you can see is about 11 and a half, probably by not quite 8 or something. It's much smaller. There is some colorization there, which would be, I think, would be hand done. And that one actually, interestingly, does have a little writing on the side. But so I'm not telling you too much about the Nuremberg problems. You probably all know more than me, but this was just a really exciting, somehow discovery to me that really captivated me. And so I managed to pick up these 3 leaves, and it's something I want to study and learn more. But I think another big aspect of it that I obviously don't have examples, but one of the things you always learn in rare book school is, like, if you've seen one copy of a book, you've only seen one copy. And the amazing thing is, if you go to see some of these bound, then they've been bound very different ways. Some of them have a much more, still have like much more original binding with the big wood binding and stuff. Anyway, it's just really exciting to think about the different elements of book history you can learn by looking at the different editions and just how these were done. So that's all I know. This book excites me somehow. Anyway, thank you.
Special Collections does have, at the university, does have a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicles as well. So if somebody wanted to look at it there, they could.
You have the whole thing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's really
And I think it's the 4th. I actually don't know the date of it. I just know we have a copy of it.
okay.
So I'm not sure if it's the original one or whatever.
Yeah. That's very cool though. Because there's only about 700 of them, I think, that have survived. And probably more Latin, because they did more. They did like 1,500 Latin copies and only about 1,000 German copies. And so it's my understanding there's about 700 somewhere that are left.
Cool. Okay. Questions, comments from anyone? No, I think that's very cool, Tamara. Thanks for sharing.
Well, I did one comment is, the idea of if you can't afford the book or can't find it, just buy a leaf, and you get a lot just with a single leaf or two.
Mm-hmm.
So who else collects leaves is Kim Turner.
Okay.
He is always buying a leaf or two from Philip Haraj at the Seattle Antiquarian Book Fair.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no idea how many he has at this point, but it would be interesting to see a slideshow of his, many of which are, manuscript and illuminated and etc.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's even with this in the last year. I know it's not too long ago that I encountered it. Someone was able to actually has put together another copy of the Nuremberg Chronicles by getting all these leaves from the various places. It took him like 40 years, but he was able to put together a copy. So
Wow, that's cool. All right, that's great. Matt?
Hi, am I unmuted? Can you hear me all right?
We can, yes.
All right, I'm doing this away from home, so I'll see if I can get through this. So this is my book. It's a Dutch book on early ascetic church leaders and writers. And I don't speak Dutch, so I'm not gonna try to read the title to you, but there it is for you if you wanna go look it up on WorldCat. It's an early 17th century book. I think I had the binding as the first image.
Mhm.
Okay, so yeah, the binding on the left, it's a contemporary binding, lacking some clasps. Otherwise, there's no tooling or anything particularly special about the binding. The reason I have it in my collection is it is the title page, which is really probably the only thing noteworthy about the book, was designed and illustrated by Peter Paul Rubens in Antwerp in around 1617, I think is when this was published. So thereabouts, he designed the title page. He was buddies with printers in Antwerp, in particular the Balthasar Moretus of the Plantin Press. They were like childhood friends, so he would regularly illustrate books for him. So there's about 40 some books out there, maybe a little bit more than that, are known to have been illustrated. Can you go to the next slide? So that's why it's in my collection. On the left there, you see the engraving's been signed as invented by him. The reason I brought this one is on the right here, you see some manuscript binder's waste used to reinforce the spine, which was common practice at this point, where they were recycling materials. It's very common in all these old contemporary bindings to be able to see some manuscript waste. This is a piece of choir music, probably 15th century. But what is so special about this book is on the verso of this manuscript waste, which is on the next slide, or maybe the slide after this. So this is on the left here is what has been in the past few years has, I believe now been known as a red frisket sheet. So this is essentially was used for the printing of color in the 15th century and 15th, 16th century. To understand it, I just Googled a random printing press. If you can imagine on the bottom, you'd put your type, where it says the tympan, you would put your piece of paper, and then you'd have this frisket that would serve for a few functions. One, it would like protect the edges of the paper, the margin of paper from inking. It would also, your paper, when you pressed it, was always wet down ahead of time. So when you lifted the page out, it would pull the page away from the inked typeset so that it would pull off easily. However, if you can imagine, if you've ever seen a book from the 17th century that has like a historiated initial that's printed in a different color, usually red, what they would do is they would have to have something like this, a frisket sheet that would essentially act as a mat for the rest of the page. So you would, to back up, so let's say you wanted to print a page in primarily black and have like a red initial. You would put a blank for your big red A, ink it all black, put it in the press, lift it out, and then you would put this red frisket sheet, this piece of parchment in, re-ink it, you'd see the whole text, ink it in red, you'd see the whole text, and then you would just cut out where the letter A would go. So you'd put your A in, ink the typeset again, put it down. So essentially this little piece of manuscript was a mat that would allow for only the red ink to transfer through for the printing. So the result of this, if you can imagine, they would reuse this piece of parchment for hundreds or thousands of times, depending on the print run. So if you go to the next page, you can see, so this is text that has been printed on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And you can kind of see on the left and right, more so the left, I think, with the shadow, how it's been slowly, that red ink has slowly built up over time. I've tried to identify the text as far as what the source is, but you can tell that they're letters, but it's too hard for me to figure out what these words are. It's I've been told if I get a black light, sometimes that helps, but yeah, haven't been able to identify the source text. But I think it's a neat item as far as the history of the book, because in a lot of ways, this was actually a part of a printing press that was then recycled into the binding of a book. There's a woman in London, Dr. Elizabeth Savage. You mentioned the Rare Book School in London. I believe she's lecturer there at times. She's doing a survey on surviving red frisket sheets. And I think she came out with the survey first in 2014. And there's only like a few dozen, I believe, that are known in the world that I accidentally came upon. And next time she publishes, I've been communicating with her. She's going to have this published in her latest survey. And I believe I read in a paper she wrote that these have only been identified since 2000 is when they first discovered what these were. And I didn't even know what this was when I first bought it. I bought it for the Rubens engraving, saw this frisket sheet, and at first I thought it was some sort of weird reaction with the glue and the ink that was causing it to bubble up, not really thinking about frisket sheets at all. So I just thought it was an interesting thing for you guys to see as a history of the book and like how books were manufactured, because in a lot of ways this was like an actual artifact from color printing in probably the 16th century. I think that was all I had for slides. I can't really remember. Oh no, there's one more. Another close-up. As an aside, that's what's kind of also funny. I don't think I got a photo of it because, you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of impressions of this red ink. Somewhere along the line, the printmaker's beard hairs fell out, and there's a couple early printer beard hairs stuck inside of the caked up ink. So if anyone wants to do some DNA cloning, we could have like a new Jurassic Park with some printers or something. I think that was it.
Or maybe
that
we
was
could do a genealogical testing to figure out.
Oh yeah, get them on 23andMe.
Yeah, maybe they're like, you know, somebody famous.
That'd be fun.
Possibly Rubens was in the room when it was done.
See, I'm curious about that. I've been wanting to reach out to Dr. Savage about that because I don't know if there's a connection necessarily between the printer that prints the 17th century book, or what that trade was like as far as like because so often, you know, the printer that was making the book was not the same entity as the book binder. Back then it was like separate.
Right.
So where this frisket sheet came from, it may not have been even a printer in Antwerp. That's kind of hard to say. Because the book is certainly like published in 1617, but the frisket sheet could be easily 16th century or earlier. It's just, there's no way of knowing unless we can identify the text, the splotchy red text.
Wow, that's very cool. So Matt, what inspired you to acquire this book?
So the whole reason I purchased it was for the Rubens. So I collect books illustrated by Rubens as well as a few other people, but
okay.
Rubens has been a main focus of mine for a few years. I hopped on Abe Books at one time, and periodically I just kind of browsed known titles that Rubens did and came across a copy. I don't think I kind of bought it as just a check a box. I don't think this is a particularly nice title page that he designed compared to some of his others, which can be very beautiful. The book dealer did not say that there was a manuscript waste exposed or had any listing on this, so it was a pleasant surprise when I got it in the mail.
Awesome, that's great. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Matt, I love it. I hope that at some point we can see this book and maybe some of other ones in person. Look great. Amazing.
Oh yeah, it is cool to see in person because you can really see that red. I tried to take a raking light photograph so you can see how that ink is just really built up, but it's really obvious in person how there's some meat to the ink.
Yeah. Now, if you could take it back to my my high school days, there'd be a black light that you could check it out in.
Oh, okay.
Because black
Next to
light,
some, next
that was
next
a
to
thing.
some,
That was a thing back in the 70s. So
yeah, next to your some mushroom posters and stuff. And
exactly. All right. Next we have Gary. You got to unmute, Gary.
So why don't you go to the first slide? I didn't control myself very well, so I did send a lot of slides into images to Tim, mostly just to give you a flavor of this book, which I think is it's a terrific book. It is my copy of this book, written by Joseph Blumenthal, who's an expert on the book on topography and and has written other books on similar subjects. Is readily available in hardback and in paper, and mine is a paper copy, but in quite good condition, as you can see. It's less good now that I've broken the spine a bit taking images, but it's still quite good. This book is taken from the collection of, as you can see, from the Pierpont Morgan Library, one of mine, and I'm sure several of your favorite places to visit when you're in New York City. And it's so as we leave through here, it's just interesting to consider what a fantastic collection J. Pierpont Morgan and his son Jack collected, back in the early part of the 20th century, and have been preserved and probably, no doubt, added to since then. Next. So I just wanted to give you the basics here, because this is going to be kind of a tour through the book. As you can see, the table of contents, it really is a history, starting from Gutenberg. So it's printing as we know it in the Western world, and then how it went through all the different countries. Oh, I guess I can use my own. That's nice. I can use my own pointer, and then down into the more recent times, picking up a lot of these different periods that we are all familiar with to one degree or another. Next, just to give you an example, he really is. This is the history of printers and book designers and printers. And so what you have, he loves Jensen as a typographer. So you get, you'll get, paragraph on him. You get Aldous Manutius, and you get a couple of pages on Aldous. Next, this is mostly, I'm not going to try, and so we get up into the English printing. We got Caslin, John Baskerville. I just love Baskerville print, and I have I would say a lot. I have a few books on topography, and Baskerville certainly one of the great topographers, print designers. One of the things that I just, as an aside, I just read the book, The Bookseller of Florence, and one of the things that I discovered reading that book was, some of the early printing was Gothic and very difficult, at least for us to read. And then somewhere, when they were still doing manuscripts, they started to change the typeface to a more a legible, elegant typeface, which they called ancient, because it was actually a reference back to some earlier typefaces, to some of the Roman typefaces. And so a lot of the typefaces we see, like Baskerville, is really based on, this started to kind of develop even before printing, as they started to experiment with more legible typefaces in manuscript form. Next. Yeah, this just carries on. You see how, I'm kind of the depth of the discussion of Baskerville, and then we go right into Bondoni, who is another wonderful designer of, his print is still a popular print typeface. Next. I copied this a little bit because Franklin gets a nice mention as a printer in Blumenthal's text, and then we go into the British presses. A book would not be complete without something from William Morris and the Kelmscott Press. Next. And then, so there was, let me see how many pages of text. There are only 51 pages of text in the book, but there are let me see how many plates. 121, 23, 123, 125 plates. So, and the plates so that's what we're now into here, is then some of the earlier, this gives you an idea of the Gutenberg Bible on the left, and then a more modern typeface done by Spira on the right. Next. Here's Jansen's typeface on the left, and here we have Menuchus. Somebody's going to correct me on my pronunciation of that, but and you can see he's incorporated some really nice illustrations in this book. Very charming. Next. So here is something from Ben Franklin. Again, consider the extent of the collection there at the Morgan. A Baskerville type, a Baskerville book on the right. It isn't you can just see this on just such elegant Roman typeface here. You could see this on a old Roman tombstone and see how this is, in a way still, so we're still coming out of the out of the Renaissance in a way, as a lot of the learning and designs from Rome were then being more appreciated in Renaissance, and then carried forward into our day. Next. Here's a nice Baskerville typeface, and Bondoni, which isn't this elegant? I think it's just, look at the amount of white space in here and how readable this is. Next. Well, if you can speak the language, that's a little bit of an issue. So we have the Doves Press. We're getting into some of the, the arts and crafts period, and in some ways they look back, but you see just a very artistic hand at work here in laying out this page. And this is from their this Genesis at the beginning of the Bible. So a marvelous page. I don't think it falls into the really readable category, but it is a beautiful page. And then a more modern typeface on the right. This is from Elmer Adler, the Pinson Printers in New York. This is in 1928, I think it says. So you see the impact of Art Deco on the typeface here. Very elegant. John Henry Nash. I think there are a number of people in our book club that collect John Henry Nash. And here's an example of his work on the left. Updike, Daniel Berkeley Updike, I think one of the kind of in some ways set the standard for readable texts in the 20th century. That was his goal, was to have book design that did not call attention to itself. You could contrast this to the Dove's Press, to Nash, or to the Dove's Press earlier. This is all about the text. Next. Eric Gill. I just love Eric Gill. He's a wonderful designer, quite an eccentric if you know him, but did sculpture and typefaces and book design. And this is just an example of his work here. Of course, Bruce Rogers, one of our the great American book designers and typographers here on the right. Next. Again, here's a Bible done by Bruce Rogers. I was delighted to see a reference in the book and an image from Dard Hunter's work, paper making by hand in America. I've been a fan of Dard Hunter for a long time, and you'll see his I wrote an article a few years ago for the journal about Dard Hunter, and his Mountain House Press is in Chillicothe, Ohio, 30 miles from my hometown of Wellston, Ohio, down in southeastern in Ohio in the hills. So this book, the paper here would have been probably paper that he made in his mill on the Hudson River. The typeface is all his design, and it was hand cut by him. All the printing was done by him. The book sales were all done by him. The binding was all done by him. So he was pretty much a one-man operation because he wanted to have complete control over his product. He did have books published earlier on paper making that were commercially published. And next. So here's as you can see, this is David Godin, publisher has done just wonderful publisher. I think that may be probably my last slide. Let's see if there's anything else.
Nope, that's it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to call your attention to another Blumenthal book. I'm going to violate the standards here of just holding this up. This is called The Printed Book in America by Blumenthal, and it's it's got half text and half images, and a beautifully produced book. it can also be acquired in paper or hardback. Well, easily. The art of the printed book, probably $20 would get you a nice copy, and $15 would get you a nice copy of the printed book in America. Okay, that's it for me.
Great, thanks, Gary. That's a very cool book. It's nice to see all the different examples of everything. Did anybody have any questions, comments? Okay, well, thanks, Gary. Up next is Mark.
Great. Okay, let's just go into that first. Do you have the first image of the cover that I sent? If not, there we go. This, I have to say, is probably one of the most enjoyable books I've read in a long time. It's 12 Journeys into the Medieval World by Christopher D Hamill. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Christopher D Hamill's work, but he worked for Sotheby's, cataloging the manuscripts and rare books that came through Sotheby's for many years. And one of the prerequisites of working for Sotheby's was you had to read Latin to study the manuscripts, which I think would be very important. But it also helps Christopher D Hamill give insight to many of the books, or if not all of the books that are in this collection. Basically, what he's doing in this book is he's taking us, well, let's say that 99.9% of us will never be able to see these books. They're buried in churches, collections. You take like the Book of Kells, which is at Trinity College in Dublin. None of us will ever probably be able to see the Book of Kells. And so what he does is he takes you all over Europe and across the United States, from the Morgan Pierpont Library all the way to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and takes you behind the scenes and talks about basically the adventure of finding these books and how he was able to access them. Each chapter in the book is just filled with historical facts and figures. And most importantly, from my viewpoint, I love the little backstories behind most of the books in this collection. There are 12 books that he covers. And what I did was, rather than rush it, I took one book for each night. And then the next night I would start the next chapter. And that way it made me slow down and enjoy the book as much as I could. Next one, please. Okay, I believe the titles of the files aren't with it, but I believe this is the Hamburg Chaucer. And what was interesting about the Hamburg Chaucer was there were two copies made, and these are the two oldest surviving examples of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And of course, it predates William Morris. I'm trying to find the date here for it. It's about 1400. And it's in the National Library of Wales. An interesting side story to this is we know that, did someone say something?
No.
Okay. We know that the scribe was someone by the name of Adam Pinkhurst. And the only reason we know this is we have a letter from Chaucer that admonishes a scribe named Adam to be more careful in his copying. And so what they did was they went back and started researching historical documents and found a letter, a document signed by one Adam Pinkhurst of London. When they compared the handwriting, they found it to be one and the same as was in the Hamburg Chaucer. So those are the little stories I enjoy almost more than the history of the book itself. It is just the research, the documentation, the provenance of some of these books. Next slide. This is from the Copenhagen Psalter. And it was it's interesting. It doesn't show you on this particular page. It dates to about 1170, and it's probably some of the finest example of illuminated manuscripts ever made. What's interesting is you take the date of 1170 and you compare it to works that were done in the 1400s and 1500s and 1300s, and the quality from book to book is so different. You have books that are masterpieces, and you have some that are so crude. It looked like it was done by the lowliest scribe in the monastery to make the book. It's not like studying Renaissance art and watching from early Renaissance to Renaissance and seeing the progress onto Mannerism, and from Mannerism to Baroque. You see this steady climb in the work that's being made, but you don't see that in the manuscripts, and I'm not sure why that is. Next slide, please. This would be the Hours of Jean de Navarre. And what's interesting about this particular one is we've all heard the story of the train car parked on the tracks at Berchtesgaden, which was the private train of Hermann Göring following the end of World War II, when they thought it was a brick that was holding the train door open, and instead it was the Duc de Berry's Book of Hours. This was probably the second most famous book that was found in that train car. And when they were unloading these train cars, they weren't careful about where the books went and what happened to them. And some of them disappeared until a monastery in France had sustained roof damage. And so this particular book was sent to a restorer to ascertain how much of the damage, how badly the book had been damaged, and what repairs can be made. And that's when they discovered this was the long lost book, because once it had been documented that it was in the train car, it disappeared from about 1945 to sometime in the 60s. Next slide. This is probably one of my favorite. This is Hugo Picture. And this is the first known example of a scribe giving himself credit for making a manuscript. His name is signed. He drew a picture of himself. And what's really interesting, you see two tools. He has in his left hand, he has his reed pen. His right hand, he has the knife for scraping the parchment or vellum when he makes a mistake. And the other interesting thing I found about this illustration was the fact that he uses an inkhorn to hold his ink. And if you look, it makes me want to go back and rewatch the movie The Name of the Rose with Sean Connery, and to notice, let's watch what the scribes are using, because in almost every movie I've ever seen, they're using jars of ink, not inkhorns, which is probably inaccurate. And I'm not sure when the change was made, or if some scribes used jars of ink, or if they all used inkhorns until a certain point. I'm just not sure about that, but I thought that was interesting that I had never seen an actual inkhorn being used. Next slide. This is the, I believe it's the Spinola Hours. And what's interesting, no, this isn't, I'm sorry, I got lost there. I'm not sure which one this is. This could be the Gospels of St. Augustine, dating, and it probably is dating back to the 6th century. And what's interesting, the illustration on the right is from the Bayeux Tapestry. And you can see the similarities. The Bayeux Tapestry, of course, is about 400 years after the Gospel of St. Augustine, and yet you can see the similarity in the illustrations used. And what I'm wondering is, what is the earliest known illustration or work in an illuminated manuscript of the Last Supper? And you notice the one on the right isn't the Last Supper. It represents a different feast, but the similarities between the two paintings are striking. Next slide.
Looks like an early pizza right here.
It does. You know,
Could be the first image of a pizza. Yeah.
Mark, that was all the images that I had. I hope I didn't miss something.
Is that all the images? Oh, okay.
So this, I wanted to ask you then, is this is the Bayeux Tapestry, which we saw?
The one on the right side was the Bayeux Tapestry. The one on the left is from the Gospels of St. Augustine.
Exactly, this one here. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that's quite, it takes up a whole room to see that thing.
And I could be mistaken on that Gospels of St. Augustine. I'm looking at my notes, and it could be the Spinola Hours. And that is from 1515 to 1520. One of the things I did, in case, I'm not sure, it may be that you did not get one of the illustrations, but there's one I wanted to talk about, which was the Spinola Hours. And that was the one that was in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And what is interesting about the story behind this is the book was originally acquired by H.P. Cross, a manuscript dealer. And the way that he got the manuscript, it was at an auction in 1976, and Hans Cross sat in the audience ready to bid. At 60,000 pounds, he glumly shook his head and dropped out of the bidding war, while the bidding rose to and finally closed at 3,700 pounds. The winning bid came from Hans Cross, the man who had stopped bidding. It turns out that he had a prior agreement with the auction house. No matter what he did, whether it was to shake his head or anything else, he was still bidding as long as he had his glasses on. It's these kind of backstories and little bits of history that I love. And this is what I loved about this book. It was one of these books you could curl up, and it was almost, you know, how you like to sometimes curl up with a glass of wine to go with the book. I think the book was the wine. I enjoyed it that much. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mark, on the photo or the picture, the illustration of the monk with the writing tools, Hugo, I think you said his name was. Do you know what's on his head?
Let's take a look. No, I don't.
It just looks like such an interesting.
Looks like a bow.
Branches. There's something behind him, just beyond his left hand, that looks like it's along this. Might be the same thing, but he used green in a lot of the elements in that drawing.
Huh.
No, I really don't know, and it could be in the book. It talks about it, but I don't remember seeing that.
It almost looks like a turban.
It does. It does. I think it's like olive branches resting on his ear, laurels. Something like that, but I can't be certain. And you know what's interesting about that inkhorn is I remember growing up, and my grandparents spoke German, and my great-grandparents spoke German, and I can remember at the time they didn't talk about inkwells. They referred to them as inkhorns, which I thought interesting. And this is the first time I'd seen an illustration of an inkhorn. And I don't know what it was capped with, to keep the ink from drying out, or if it was simply allowed to dry and you added some glycerin or moisture to it and reactivated it. I don't know.
Very cool.
Mark, I understand that you have a collection of writing implements or things that were used in connection with either writing or printing. Is that true?
It is true. I collect dip pens, vintage dip pens, also ink bottles, inkwells, and occasionally if I find a manuscript, most of my manuscripts are like a Shan manuscript from what was then known as Burma, or I have an Islamic manuscript, but I like to find anything relative to the art of writing, whether it's textbooks on practicing cursive, starting with elementary school and all the way up to the professional.
Well, I can see why this book was right up your alley then.
It was. It definitely was.
Very nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Looks like that's some things that would be nice to see in person as well. Do a little tour sometime.
Of the what? You mean the collection?
Yes.
Or Jane Carlin and I are working on that. We're hoping it's tentatively in the works, where we would have an exhibition of writing at Collins Library.
Oh, awesome.
That'd be Finn. That'd be great. Perfect place for it. Yeah.
All right. Next was Ryan.
Hello. So I don't have nearly as much to say about my book. It's probably not nearly as interesting as many of the books presented so far today. The book I chose, I don't have a lot of books. I have a fairly substantial library, but I don't really have many books about books. So I was really kind of having to really think about what would be a good book for this particular Biblio Stone Soup. And the book that came to mind is a book. It's about the art of the Australian children's book illustrator Graham Base, whom if you were a child, in the 1980s and 90s, like I was in the English-speaking world, you probably are familiar with. You've probably seen some of his books before because he was an extremely popular children's book illustrator back, 25, 30 years ago. He's still alive. He's not very old, but I think his most popular books were published in the late 80s, early 90s. So here's the book here. It's actually written by Julie Watts, who is an Australian, she's British born, like Graham Base. She's actually born in England and then moved to Australia. This book, I've had him for at least a decade. I'm not a children's book enthusiast particularly, but I loved Graham Base's art so much as a kid that I've held on to all the books of his I had from my childhood. And this book, which was published, I don't know, at some point in the last 15 years or so, I got it as a Christmas present. And it's just really kind of an overview of Graham Base's career up to that point. He collaborated extensively in it. There's a lot of his commentary and pictures showing, the various evolution of illustrations in the book. So the cover illustration here is from his probably most famous book, which is Animalia, which is in the lion's mouth there. So that's probably his most famous book. I actually did a little piece about it it got published in the journal, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago. So yeah, Graham Base, why I like his illustrations, they're very colorful. I mean, they're very technically good. They're very interesting and they're rich with detail. There's always lots of little bits of things you don't stop. Each time you look at it, you notice something else. It's hard kind of to exhaust his art. So if you go to the next slide. So yeah, unfortunately, the photos I took may not be of the highest quality, unfortunately. So the illustration on the right here is from his second most famous book, The 11th Hour, which is kind of a mystery book, published also in the late 80s. I don't know if the photo fully does it justice, but it's some wonderful illustrations there. And then on the left is an etching. It's not the actual final illustration. It's just the penciling in, and this was modified, but from one of his earlier books called My Grandmother Lived in Gully Goat. So if you're a Graham Base fan, these books are really fun to look at. Did I have any more illustrations? I can't even remember. Did I send? It was just these three. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's really it. Not much more to add to that, but it is good. Yeah. It's probably the only book I probably really have about books. So, any questions? No, probably not. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Very nice. Next was Jody.
Hello. So, I have two books that I'm going to talk about, and but they're both examples or explain examples of a format that I've come to be very interested in, and that's the livre d'artiste, which is an artist's book. If you want to loosely translate that, and the livre d'artiste probably has its origin in William Blake's work and the illustrations that he did, his copper engravings and the text that he wrote and the illustrations that he added to it all became a single unit as a book, as separate from a single artwork. But the livre d'artiste is this integrated work of art that finds its way into a book. And there are going to be four things that are really important. One is that the art that's in the book is not necessarily illustrating the text in a very literal way. And the art itself becomes this important graphic statement and can stand on its own. And number three is the art is done by the artist himself, him or herself, or at his studio, or in collaboration with another artist. And the really interesting part is that these are all limited editions, rarely exceeding 200 copies. But William Blake lived in the 18th century, and what I'm going to really talk about are two books from the late 19th century and then in the 20th century. So this is a very famous livre d'artiste. It's the Raven, the poem by Edgar Allan Poe, translated to Le Corbeau by Stephen Mallarmé in Paris in 1875, and it becomes a livre d'artiste. It's a huge book. It's 21 3/4 inches tall and 14 inches wide. It's a beautiful book, and the particular edition that I have is a reprint done by Lucia Marquand, Ed Marquand Books, where they translate the poem back from the French into English. And the reason why that's important is because Mallarmé took a fair amount of liberty in translating in doing his translation of the Poe work. Poe was wildly popular in Paris, and way, way more so than he was in the States. And everybody wanted a piece of the Poe action. And so Mallarmé was keen on learning English and translating the poem. And then in the Marquand edition, it's translated back into English, and you get to see some of the liberties that Mallarmé took with the poem. But the interesting part in terms of the livre d'artiste is the illustrations are done by Edward Manet. And this is the Raven that is on the title page and on the front cover of the portfolio. And I'm going to show you those illustrations so you can begin to see some of the development of this livre d'artiste format. So Tim, we could have the next slide, two slides here. You see Manet has this very impressionistic perspective, and this was very, very unusual, not done in books at the time. And it feels rough and just very freshly drawn and not really studied, and just dashed off almost. And yet we have this sense of this melancholy individual in his study. And then in the picture on the right, the next one in the book, you see that this raven has come to visit him, and of course he's lost his love, and the raven is somehow enticing him into the world in which she has entered. Next slide. And then I wanted to sort of compare that with Henry Matisse's work. Matisse is known and had been known for decades as a painter. And when he starts making books, he starts using paper cutouts to sort of plan the page, the spread. And those paper cutouts will ultimately become the way he will express himself as an artist in the latter part of his life. So the work that he did in his books sort of begin to show us how he's beginning to explore this new way of doing things for him. And he finds it very compelling because it's fresher. The visual narrative is closer to what he feels, and he's spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to bring all this together. And Mark, I see your question is the medium of those now I don't see it. The medium of those, what is the medium?
Is the medium of those illustrations charcoal, or are they washes?
No, the book, Jazz, and the book I'm going to talk about, was produced with, let's see, Matisse painted gouache on paper and then cut the paper. So if you're looking at the illustration on the far left of the screen, you see the yellow. That would have been a big piece of yellow, and he cut it so that it could lay over top of the black piece, and the blue the same way. So these gouache colors are rich and full and very, very nice. And when he wanted to have them reproduced in the big portfolios for this production, he had them done in pochoir, which is a stencil process. And then he had the actual gouache that he used for these illustrations. The artist used that gouache to do the stenciling. However, it was flat, and there were many critics who complained that the illustrations were flat. Rather than showing that cut edge of the paper, it sort of dissolved into something that looked like just a regular print. And people had expected, I think, to see a little more of the paper edge. And it disappointed Matisse. But it didn't stop him. He continued to work at this. This particular book is also fairly. It's a large format book. It's 146 pages. There were 250 copies made of it, and plus an additional 20 non-commercial copies, all of which were signed by Matisse. And then there were 100 albums of just the images, not the texts, that were made available. And this book was published in 1947, and it shows this transition that Matisse is making from painting to this cutouts. And I think the thing that fascinates me about this is, a book, a codex, is a series. It's like a journey. You're going to turn the pages of the book, and you are going through this journey. And whoever has made this book, conceived of it, designed it, is intentionally taking you through this material in a very particular way. And Matisse sees this as a better way to communicate to this visual narrative that he is experiencing in his own life, the changes of his life, things that are of interest to him, his observations. And so he's looking at that relationship of text to art. And I think that is the real defining characteristic of the livre d'artiste. One thing I just tell you this because I love this part. All of Matisse's books, all 8 of them that he made, were all, except for one, were all completed when he was in Nice during World War II. He fled Paris when the Nazis invaded, And actually, literally, the day he was leaving Paris, he ran into Picasso, who said, "Why are you leaving? Why are you giving up the fight?" Yeah, and Picasso said that this fight would be so important because we're trying to protect the right of artists, of people to express themselves. And if you're going to Nice to to support the Vichy government, who were supporters of the Nazis, then you're giving up all your artistic rights. And Matisse kind of blew it off and said, "No, I got to get out. I'm getting out of town." But he didn't forget what Picasso said. And while he was in Nice, he changed his political perspective to so that by the end of the war, he was firmly in the resistance efforts that were going on. So I think, again, it's sort of the narrative of a person's life, as if they're going to make a book, that narrative can come into play in some really interesting ways. And Matisse is just a fantastic example of that. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you. Any questions or comments or anything?
Did Matisse do the text? Who did the text for like his books or for jazz?
For jazz, Matisse wrote the book.
Okay.
Several of his other books, he took texts from basically French writers, some of them contemporary, and I think there were two that are historic. He added things to all those texts. They're all written like this. They are not typeset. And this one was engraved, and it's actually an etching. The printing process was etching. And he received some criticism that he couldn't, there are no straight lines, and there should be straight lines in a book, like margins and stuff like that. And he really poo-pooed that. He said it's not necessary, and that he thought his curves were more expressive of human nature than straight lines.
Very cool.
What a cool thing to have, Jody.
Yeah, this is a book of it's essentially an exhibition catalog of an exhibit of all 8 of Matisse's books that happened at the Pompidou in 2019, and of course is a kind of a victim of the pandemic, and so it was never really seen. But the book got published by the University of Chicago Press. So
I see.
Fascinated. It's a fascinating book.
I see. Okay. Right.
Okay. All right. So that brings up me next. I'm going to talk about the libraries of the presidents. So, one of the things that is my passion is biographies of presidents. And one of the things, so I have a collection of books related to presidents, primarily biographies. But one of the things that's of interest to me is the books owned by presidents, the libraries that they had themselves. And it started some years ago. I was at a book fair down in LA, and there was this copy of this book that was from the library of U.S. Grant. And at the time, it was a pretty inexpensive book. I didn't buy it just because it was like an almanac kind of thing, and I just thought, oh, how could this have actually been very important? It probably just was bound with his binding or something. But I didn't think too much of it in terms of having any value. And as I've studied the libraries of books and how they bound things and the things that they kept, I realized that actually was a pretty significant piece that I should have bought at the time. That's one of those that got away. But, that was the story that kind of prompted everything. So one of the things I've been trying to do is learn more about the libraries of the presidents. And There's actually not a lot of books on that. There's some on, of course, Jefferson is very famous, and a few others, but as far as like comprehensive information, there's not a ton. I did come across this publication by Rosenbach, and that's a name that I think a lot of us would recognize. Rosenbach was a book dealer back, in the early ages of book dealing, and back in the turn of the century. He actually created or worked with a number of the major collectors of the robber barons. One of them is Huntington, of course. And so he had acquired many of the books that are in the Huntington Library today. As far as this particular item, the Library of the Presidents, and actually I guess I should have shown you that here. It's basically this essay, the short essay that he had written about books that had been owned by the presidents and about their libraries. And I found it very fascinating. It's actually you could see a little booklet here. It's 30 pages long. It was published in 1935. It says as part of I think it was related to a book fair in 1935 or 34. But he just talks about the libraries that were owned by the presidents. And the thing that's interesting is that he probably, more than any other book dealer ever in history, probably touched more of those books than anyone. And so in this text, he's talking about, how important the books are. And you can see I've highlighted some things that might be of interest, talking about the different collections. And he starts in this book, or in this booklet, he goes through the presidents from the beginning, starts off with Washington, talking about Washington as a book collector. And a lot of people don't know that Washington was a book collector because he was kind of in the shadow of Adams and Jefferson, but he actually had quite a collection of a lot of books. And you see here, it talks about Washington had his own bookbinder with his own emblem that was in the books. And that kind of goes back to my story with Grant. Also, Grant had his own bookbinder, and Grant's books were in this very dark green. That was how he had them bound. But Washington had his bookbinder. The one thing that was interesting about Washington, well, and I guess a lot of the founders, is that their books were really for more of a utilitarian purpose. And so they had, their books were their knowledge, because there weren't libraries for them to look at information. They had to have their own libraries. And so Washington had quite a bit. So anyways, it's just talking about these different things about Washington's collections, about his books. One of the things in this booklet is the book plates from the presidents, and you can see here there's a number of them listed here on the right, showing George Washington and Monroe and Adams, and then John Quincy Adams had 4 different ones that are known, which you can see on the right. There's a couple of other interesting things, like here he's talking about, on the left, he's talking about Van Buren's library, and how after his death that the books, basically had gone into this big old barn, and that the barn had leaked, and most of his collection was lost. And it's just interesting that today you could think of any president's books could just get put into boxes and left in a barn to be destroyed. And so I guess that's the main things. Actually, I'll just point out here at the end, right? He's talking about, books owned by the presidents, and, he just is kind of finishing it off and it sounds like, most of this pamphlet is kind of a historical information telling about the presidents and what happened to their libraries and their books. And then at the end, it's like, oh, this is really a great place to collect and that, you should really check out these books. It's really kind of a marketing piece as well, promoting this. And, one of the things is that Rosenbach is known for really creating the market for Americana as far as being collectible. Prior to him, people were really thinking about Europe, and he had dealt in a lot of the Gutenberg Bibles and Shakespeare and a lot of the great masterpieces that we all know and love. But he was really also really important for creating the interest in Americana. All right, just a couple of other things that I'll just hit real quick. The one thing I'll point out is that in my quest to try and figure out and learn more about the president's libraries, it's actually not in the books that I'm finding the information. It's in these little catalogs and brochures and little pieces of history that would normally just be discarded, or they're just not, they're not the traditional books that I would normally collect. But it's fascinating. And this particular one, this is about the Library of James Monroe, and it's talking about there's an introduction, and then there's a catalog of the known books that he had, which you can see here. Yeah, so that's the main thing, and actually kind of interesting. So you have this description of his library and everything, and then what's interesting as well is that as I go through this, there's all these check marks of different books that some previous owner had obviously gone through and been checking this off. And I always wonder, okay, are these ones that were in the wish list? Are they ones that they owned? What's the story behind the checks in this particular case? All right, and then just finally, as I was actually working on this and kind of thinking about what to do, my catalog from the Lincoln bookstore in Chicago, Abraham Lincoln Bookshop came, and in this catalog, there's this item here listed here for a book from the Library of James Buchanan, which I found interesting. You do find books from time to time that were owned by the presidents, and in this case, it's saying that he had signed it. In addition, it was signed by his niece, and which is actually quite interesting because particularly a lot of the earlier presidents and their collections and in their libraries, they would sign their names in the front of the books, and that was their way of recording that it belonged to them, and which was interesting as well. When George Washington had passed, and there was the inventory that was done of books that were in his collection at the time, there were several from different volumes that he had borrowed from other people that had their signatures in the front of the book. So, anyways, I just find it fascinating. I like that there's not books about this, that it's really a treasure hunt to try and find information about the libraries of the presidents. So that's all I have. Questions, comments?
Have you seen what was that? There was an episode of Pawn Stars on the History Channel where they were selling a copy of Thomas Jefferson, a book from Thomas Jefferson's library. And one thing that they talked about was how he always signed his books by it was either the I or J signature for that choir. You'd always write T in front of it, so it looked like TJ.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. I never saw that episode, but I did read that was one way that he would mark his books, that they were his. They were kind of, it's interesting because I I think for us collectors, most of us would never write our name in some book that was, that was significant, right? I wouldn't. I don't know if you're a president, I guess you would. But you're right about his little mark that he would put in there. That's like his way of marking that it was his book without making it so obvious with the book plates and some of the other things. So that is very cool. Yeah, Tamara.
Yeah, well, I just had one question because I'm always interested in how people do mark their books. Are you the person that put the squares around certain sections of the text as something that was important to you, and the underlining, or was that somebody else previous to you, a previous owner?
Oh, these boxes I put on there just to illustrate the things that I was going to talk about.
Oh, so they're not even really in the book?
They're not in the book.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that initially when I saw the first one had all that underlining, and I'm thinking, well, number one, it was very, it was very, very clean, very nicely done. But I'm thinking, I bet that Tim just added that electronically. So
okay.
So yeah. I started.
So I rested after thinking it through. So Tim, was that the last presenter then?
We just had Jane's, so we're just going to talk about.
Oh, yeah, let's have Jane's. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we started with the recording of Cindy, and we'll finish with Jane's slides. And Jane's not here, so I have her notes here, and I know I'm not going to do it justice, but I'll hit the main points as well, unless there's any other questions or anything. All right, so what's cool about the books that Jane was talking about or was going to talk about is they're actually essays that she wrote on the art of, the history of art books. And so there's 3 different essays that she wrote that were published by, it's in here somewhere. Yeah. It will come up to it, but these are the 3 essays that she wrote on the history of art books, which I think is very, very cool. Not only is it her contribution to our world of knowledge on books, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. So I thought it's disappointing that she couldn't be here. And I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to mute myself here if I can. Oh, maybe not. Okay. All right. So the first one here. Well, I don't know if I have them in the right order. I'll just go ahead. So there's 3 different ones. There's this and this. And yeah, Thames and Hudson is who published her things. But let me just go ahead and read about all 3 of them here real quick. So the first one is the color in Zimmer's window, and I know I pronounced that wrong. It's about the early days of first modern art book. Profiles by Alan Zimmer, a Dutch bookseller who moved from Britain and worked with British publishers and booksellers throughout the Second World War, and promoted first publications on major British artists such as Henry Moore, and promoted the avant-garde periodicals such as Verve and Fullerton. It was Zweimer who displayed the very first color reproductions of Cézanne, Renoir, and Van Gogh in his windows. And this is, so I guess that's what we're seeing here, where you can see those art in the windows. The next one was Alberta Skira, Color Impressio Chronicles, that contributes, whose chronicles the contributions on Swiss publisher Albert Skira. who was noted for his close association with contemporary artists such as Matisse, Picasso, and in fact published many of their Leva the artists. In fact, Skira and Zimmer were connected by the publications of Picasso's Jody, do you want to help me out on that one?
I think it's the Le Chef. Is it Le Chef?
Metamorphosis.
Oh, the of Ovid. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yep.
Zimmer was the only bookseller to have ordered an advance copy of this unique and at the time considered radical form of publication. Skira publishes a number of avant-garde art journalists and became the leader in high quality art publications, enjoying his own photographers and overseeing the color printing of all plates in his books. He stopped at nothing to get the perfect image of his publications. For example, in 1955, he camped inside of a cave in camp in France for an entire week to get photos of the publication. Shown on the slide are some of Skira's small format books, all bound in distinctive linen colored cloth and tipped in book plates. I don't know which one's that. Okay. And then the last one was Publishers at War. The art book survives is the story of two major 20th century art publishers, Bella Horvitz and Faden Press and Walter Narathu of Thames and Hudson, both fleeing the tyranny of the Nazi invasion. They found refuge in England and started the publishing houses. Vaderen originally focused on the classics and Thames and Hudson's on the international co-editions. Their personal stories are inspiring as they were trailblazers in increasing access to affordable color illustrated art books. The logos of the companies are still used today. Thames and Hudson represents the ties between New York and London and the growth of international publishing. And I know Jane would have done a very fabulous presentation on that. I did my best to read and express her items here.
Jane is getting ready to go to England, to Oxford for a week or so, and she says she's a little out of practice traveling, and she's quite frazzled trying to get together and having to rebook some things, and so we want to thank her for sending this stuff on to Tim. I wanted to just, when I saw Skira, I wanted to just again violate the rules here by holding up a Skira publication that I bought at one of our annual dinners. And I bought it for $5, and they're these are all, it's quite a big book, and all of the illustrations are very nicely done. They're all tipped in. And this book was part of the library of the which? No, it's not the Tower Club, but it was the club in the where we had our dinner a couple times. That's now closed. A Harbor Club.
Oh yeah,
the Harbor Club. And so they had a library there that they were getting rid of, and they said, "Well, if you want to auction some of our books, just put them in there." So I picked up a couple of the Skira things. I thought, well, these are really nicely done, and it was just nice to see that Jane has. There's a lot more to Skira than I knew about. So, I really want to thank Tim for his coordination of this and recoordination of it, and putting together the slideshows, which I've got to say, it does, we've all learned some things during this pandemic, and we can get together and share our collections on a meaningful level remotely. So I think this is certainly something I think we can. While it's fun to get together for wine and cheese and have our Biblio Stone Soup that way, this also has its pluses. So I want to thank everybody that presented, and any other comments for the good of the order?
I'll give you $6 for the book.
The postage is good. You have to come get it.
Anybody
It's quite
get
heavy. Okay. All righty. Well, everybody have a rest of a good day, and we'll see you all virtually soon. So